and our House Committee on Energy and Commerce to bring that control measure before the full committee. It's anticipated, in fact, that it will be approved in the committee by Memorial Day, so sometime during the last part of May, that it will then go to the floor of the House of Representatives this summer and be approved in the House. The White House is basically waiting for Congress to act, and the Senate is waiting for the House to act. And so all of the action at the moment on the subject of greenhouse gas controls is occurring within the confines of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And we will have that measure on our current schedule ready for House floor consideration during the summer of this year. This morning, I'm going to preview for you the context for this debate. Why is it happening? I'll also talk about the major elements of the legislation that we have under consideration and talk about the technology effects that this legislation will create. The first point to make is that controls on greenhouse gases in the United States are really no longer optional. We don't at this point really have a choice about whether or not regulation should pass and go into effect. The scientific opinion about the effects of human activities on rising global temperatures is now deeply solidified. And that fact is reflected in a whole series of reports issued by the world's leading climate scientists, collected under the umbrella of the United Nations and its Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are thousands of the leading scientists around the world, and their opinions are now virtually unanimous that human activity is the principal cause of rising global temperatures, and that unless we act, the consequences for the world will be unacceptable. Now, to be sure, there are still some who take a different view, but those who take a different view are now deeply in the minority, and their views have been seriously marginalized. I see a few heads shaking around the room, so perhaps there's some who have a different view here today. But I can report to you that this is now the consensus that is accepted in the Congress, that because the scientific opinion is so deeply solidified on the merits of this, we have an obligation to act. The real reason we no longer have an option is not that. The real reason we no longer have an option is that the U.S. Supreme Court has ended this debate. In March of last year, the court handed down a decision in the case of EPA versus the state of Massachusetts. And in that case, the court held that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. And with that finding, under the existing Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency is obligated to regulate. And in fact, EPA took the first step on that path 2 weeks ago when it issued an endangerment finding, and that clearly puts EPA on a path to regulate greenhouse gas controls unless Congress intervenes with its own control program. Virtually no one wants the EPA to pass this regulation. EPA is operating with a truly blunt instrument. That's the old Clean Air Act. And under that act, EPA cannot take into effect fully the effect of possible control scenarios on the economy. All of us in Congress want for the economy to be a key consideration. And I'll talk with you in a moment about how we're making sure that the economy, in fact, is a key consideration. So virtually everyone, whether from industry or from the environmental community, given the inevitability now of regulation, would rather have Congress regulate as opposed to having the Environmental Protection Agency regulate. And we are now on course in our committee to move forward with that regulatory measure. I want to talk just a little bit about what I'm doing in this process because I am very involved in it. I am now working with the coal industry and with the electric utilities that burn coal in order to make sure that as this regulation goes forward, that it goes forward in a way that assures growth in the market for coal over the long term. Now that's a challenge. The leading greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide. The fuel that creates the most carbon dioxide is coal. And so one might think, well, how can you control carbon dioxide emissions and still have the market for coal grow? In fact, you can. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think that's going to happen in a few moments. But the law has to be structured carefully. We have to make sure that we acknowledge the essential role of coal in this economy, and that we draft the law in order to accommodate it. Coal today accounts for 51% of the electricity generated in the United States. It is also the fuel that we have in this country. We have a 250-year reserve of coal, the largest coal reserves of any nation in the world, and we don't have adequate supplies of coal alternatives. The next cheapest fuel is natural gas, but our natural gas supplies that are proven and explorable and developable today are not adequate to meet today's needs. We're importing at the present time about 20% of all of the natural gas we consume every day from other countries, from Canada, and through liquefied natural gas being imported from the Middle East. And so if we had coal-fired utilities, for some reason because of the regulation, disabled from being able to continue to use coal, their default position would be to go to the next cheapest fuel, which is natural gas. Natural gas prices would soar. The result is that the 58% of all American homes that are heated with natural gas would experience substantial economic pain as those gas prices soar. And a range of industry, from the chemical industry to agriculture and many others, would be dislocated, deeply punished, and the consequences economically would be unacceptable for the nation as a whole. And so it's critically important that we structure this measure to take account of these realities and assure that coal use can continue even as we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what I'm working with the coal industry and the coal-fired electric utilities in order to accomplish. And I believe that we can, and we're currently on track to do that. These are the characteristics of the law that we're seeking to write. First of all, it would be economy-wide in application. In the European Union, when they controlled greenhouse gases, they elected to control just their stationary sources. That would be electric utilities and industrials. They did not extend that program to the transportation sector. They have taxes and other means of controlling greenhouse gas emissions from automobiles and trucks, but in the United States, we want to be more broadly based. And so we're planning to extend this regulation not only to the industrials and the utilities, but also to our transportation sector. For this measure to be balanced in the way that I want it to be balanced, it has to be bipartisan. And so we've reached out to our Republican colleagues on the committee. We're in consultation with them. I'm hoping that as this measure nears approval in the committee, we're going to have a strong base of bipartisan support for the bill as it moves forward. We already have industry support. The coal industry is working with us to assure that a measure that is sustainable is passed. The coal industry recognizes the inevitability of controls and is looking for ways to actually benefit from this legislation passing. The same is true of the coal-fired electric utilities. In fact, the entire utility industry is working with us to pass a sustainable measure. It's important that no economic sector be dislocated. It's important that, as I've indicated, the fuel sectors not be dislocated. But it's important, too, that we have an eye toward the chemical sector, the agriculture sector, steel manufacturers, cement producers, our industry that's exposed to trade, so that there's no jeopardy to American industry from a control program going into effect in this country at a time when perhaps other countries that house competitor industries to ours do not have a similar control program. We have to have an eye toward our industry exposed to trade. We want to make sure that this measure is fully digestible by the American economy, and our effort is directed toward that goal. The law will